Hello, everyone. Come on in, make yourselves comfortable, and we will start in a few minutes. For those of you that have already joined the call, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from.
Daniel, I think the chat is disabled, so you might not be able to get that kind of interaction in the chat.
Danielle, you're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Apologies. You've just seen that our chat function doesn't seem to be working, so do feel free to use the Q&A to say hi and introduce yourselves. And we will start in a minute. We're already coming up to quite a few people, which is wonderful to see. So we'll get started shortly. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. There's quite a few participants now here. This seems to be a topic of interest, so I'm going to get us started. We are talking today about bridging the gap and how do we move from adapting to AI to a scaled adoption of AI. I'm Daniela Weber. I lead NetHope Center for the Digital Nonprofit. This is where we do our research and develop tools to help nonprofits with their digital transformation. And of course, particularly in the last years, this has also included talking about AI a lot. The work we're going to talk about today is about a program that NetHope and Elrha run together, where we are looking at how can we advance the responsible adoption of AI in the humanitarian sector. And today we're going to focus on two work streams that we've worked on as part of that overall program. One is a piece of research on what a joint sector structure, a lighthouse or something similar, name to be decided, should look like that would be truly helpful to close that gap and achieve responsible adoption. And the other part of work we're going to talk about is scaling AI projects. And as part of this, we have provided subgrants to two organizations, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we've learned when trying to scale up existing AI projects. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelists. We are recording this webinar and it will be available on the NetHope website, so you can listen to it again or share with others that haven't been able to attend. We do not allow any AI note takers or recordings to be taken. That includes screenshots, which can only be done with our express permission. We have the Q&A function, certainly, probably not the chat, but we have the Q&A function up and running. And if you have a question for the panelists, please feel free to type that in there. We have also seen the questions you have submitted when you registered for this webinar, and some of them we'll answer as part of the panel presentations, and part of them we will try and answer afterwards, and obviously other questions that you raise during the panel, we'll try and get to those as well as time allows, of course. When you do ask questions in the Q&A function, just please keep in mind that this is a safe space. We want to respect individuals and the organizations that are in the virtual room with us. And we want our panelists and everyone that attends to feel they are in a supportive atmosphere. And of course, this is a non-partisan space. So with that out of the way, let me introduce our panelists. We have Dan Amias, who is Digital Innovation Advisor at Elrha. Fernanda Sosa, who is a Research Associate at the Professorship of Societal Computing at the Technical University of Munich. And we have our very own Elizabeth Shaughnessy, Director of Digital Programming at NetHope. Now, I'm going to jump right into the first piece of work we're going to talk about, the research. And I first wanted to ask you, Dan, what was Elrha's motivation in commissioning this piece of research?
A pleasure to be here. I'm Dan Amias. I'm the Digital Innovation Advisor at Elrha. Just a bit of background on Elrha first, and then I'll go to why we commissioned the research. So Elrha is a UK-based global charity that funds and strengthens humanitarian research and innovation. What that means in practice is we find the gaps where the sector's most pressing problems aren't being met by good evidence or good solution, and we fund and support work to fill them. And we distill what actually works, so we push it to get adopted and scaled. Evidence of what works and get it into practice is the thread that through everything we do. My focus is how the sector adopts AI responsibly, which is why I'm here, in an ethical, evidence-driven, context-appropriate AI that improves humanitarian decision-making and effectiveness without making risk, bias, or inequity worse. On AI specifically, my role runs through three things. Internally, I'm developing Elrha's own AI policy, so working through how we can use AI responsibly as an organization, because we're wrestling with the same questions that everyone else, really. And I've also supported our portfolio of AI grantees through our grant program, and I'm now leading the design of our next phase, which is this AI Lighthouse we're developing with NetHope. On why we commissioned the research. So we commissioned the research to answer a question we generally didn't have an answer to. Where is that sector actually stuck on AI, and what would it take to get it unstuck? What was obvious is that AI has already arrived. So a lot of generative tools are embedded in daily work, drafting, translation, analysis proposals. But what wasn't obvious was whether any of that was adding up to something that the sector could govern, scale, and trust. And adoption is happening super fast, but reactively and in fragments, and the sector is lacking a really clear evidence-based picture of what would actually help organizations adopt AI responsibly and at scale. And most of that, what exists is either really optimistic case studies or like high-level principles. So this gap is exactly where Elrha works, and our job is to find where the sector's most pressing problems aren't being met by good evidence or good solutions, and fund the work to fill them and get that works into practice. So before anyone builds an AI innovation, we want to understand what real need rather than assume it. What's the real need? So the point of a scoping study is to really earn the right to act by grounding it in evidence first. And we wanted to map how organizations are really using AI, the risks and the support they need, identify the gaps no existing initiative is filling, and only then test what a shared mechanism would usefully do. I'm sure you'll talk about this, but it drew on interviews across NGOs, international organizations, donors, and technology partners, plus a review of the existing frameworks and platforms. So the conclusions come from practitioners, not from us. That's really important to say. And also importantly, we want to catalyze the work already happening across the sector and make sure whatever comes next is really grounded in this evidence and designed for equity from the start.
Thank you so much, Dan, for framing the work. This is very helpful background. And I will now hand over to Fernanda to talk about what the research entailed and what the findings were in a bit more detail.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. Just a thumbs up that you can hear me. Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So as part of this research, the first thing we looked at was how is AI being currently used. As we all know here, AI techniques including machine learning and advanced statistical methods have been present in humanitarian work for years, from automated disaster mapping to chatbots supporting displaced populations. But as these tools have grown more accessible and widely deployed, debate about their broader role in humanitarian action has greatly intensified, especially as over-the-counter generative AI tools have been extensively integrated into everyday workflows. So we looked into how AI is currently being used, and we identified that 3 functional clusters dominate AI use. First is capacity compensation. As Dan already briefly mentioned, AI is being used heavily for drafting, translation, proposal writing, these tasks being the most widespread. The second one is knowledge management, from retrieving institutional memory to handling monitoring and evaluation data. And lastly, anticipatory intelligence, flood prediction, displacement modeling. These are currently more ambitious and least embedded, but are already being implemented. However, beyond functional AI usage or AI use cases, we wanted to see how AI was currently being adopted and integrated, and how advanced this adoption currently is. I believe this is the second slide. Yes. So we found some generalizable dynamics. First, we saw that governance is slowly formalizing, but unevenly. For example, we see that some organizations have gone from informal individual experimentation toward more enterprise control AI ecosystems. Primary incentives for this organizational enterprise uptake is security, privacy, and data control. However, the gap between organizations that have formalized AI governance and those still operating entirely ad hoc remains wide, and it's itself a source of sector-wide fragmentation. Second, we see that shadow AI practices are highly pervasive. Staff use unapproved tools informally, not necessarily out of bad intent, but because official frameworks haven't kept pace with productivity pressures. Third, we also see that culture sort of creates divergence. This means that in general, we see 2 extremes. On the one side, we see risk-averse organizations highly paralyzed, while innovation-oriented ones move faster than their governance can support. We also see that geographic and resource disparities highly intensifies this further, with headquarter teams generally more active and better supported than field offices. Next, we see that AI adoption is best described as sort of adapting under pressure and not necessarily part of some strategic transformation at the organization level. Organizations are largely absorbing AI into existing workflows to cope with austerity, not redesigning how they work. Also, we see that corporate and technical partnerships are largely filling capacity gaps that organizations cannot address internally, providing access to low-code tools, cloud infrastructure, and short-term license grants. We saw that this creates some risk, which I'll talk a bit more in a second. And lastly, we saw that efficiency gains are currently very personal or at the individual level, not necessarily institutional. So people recover time in their workday, but organizations rarely aggregate these gains, meaning that gains are rarely measured. If we move on to the next slide. Risks in AI use are extensively covered by the literature and sector reports, from algorithmic bias to lack of transparency and explainability. But here I want to just highlight 4 that stood out from our interviews, especially. We see shadow AI as a governance failure, sort of sitting at the intersection of governance and adoption. This is, of course, a rational response to the gap between productivity pressures and official policy timelines. But informal tool use can create data leaks, loss of oversight, and fragmented learning. We also see that budget cuts are highly accelerating such practices. Next, I would like to highlight data protection risk and information integrity. In humanitarian context, a breach doesn't just expose organizational data, it can also expose vulnerable people to physical harm. Hallucinations in AI outputs can directly cause harm where information quality is life critical. Third, of course, we can also see bias in structural inclusion. Large models are predominantly trained on global north data, as we all know, underperforming in low resource languages and non-Western contexts. Bias in needs assessment or resource allocation can wrongfully exclude the most vulnerable populations. And finally, one of the AI sort of dynamics that we saw at the beginning, vendor dependency, value misalignment can create a lot of risks. Corporate partnerships, as I mentioned before, are filling a lot of capacity gaps, but at the same time are creating lock-in and raise questions about whether tech partners' values align with humanitarian principles. So given such risks, if we move to the next slide, we wanted to look a bit closer into how organizations can govern AI responsibly to mitigate these challenges. The governance landscape is not a vacuum. Frameworks do exist. The problem is that they are highly fragmented, formatted for specialists, and there's no shared interpretive layer that makes them usable for practitioners in the field navigating real adoption decisions. And I believe Elizabeth wants to jump in here, as they conducted recently a very, very nice study.
Yes, thanks. Thank you. If we go to the next slide, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I appreciate this is a big image. And don't worry, there is a link that I can share. It's on our website. It's from a report essentially that we recently produced. So something that we've been looking at is what, this broader governance landscape actually looks like, and specifically where our sector fits within that. And this question is what drove this new report that NetHope has released called AI Governance in the Nonprofit Sector, specifically looking at this, what we call the missing middle, written by our colleague Michelle. So Michelle had analyzed 53 AI governance instruments. So everything from like binding regulations like the EU AI Act, the intergovernmental principles, AI developer frameworks, from companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, to some sector-specific instruments that exist. There are not many, but those that exist. It wasn't obviously an exhaustive list. It didn't cover every, for example, country level governance instruments. There were some that we wouldn't be able to include in this research, but it is still like as a touch point, 53 instruments, and then scored them against 14 themes that matter specifically to how nonprofits and humanitarian organizations develop, procure, and deploy AI. And so what the finding really is what we're calling this missing middle, where governance exists at the top. So you have the broad regulations, the intergovernmental principles, you have national strategies. It also exists at the bottom with individual organizational policies, but what's almost entirely absent is this sector-wide layer in between. So those are the shared standards, operational tools, the collective frameworks that would help organizations not have to figure everything out by themselves. And the three most under-addressed themes across all of these instruments that were looked into were the funder-grantee relationship, so the dynamics between donors and organizations that fund around AI adoption, the humanitarian principles alignment, and data protection in low infrastructure settings. And so these are gaps that can't be filled by this broader AI governance activity. So this is something that really has to come from the sector itself. We really have to be building these ourselves. We won't find this in, a regulator or an AI developer, a tech company that is developing AI, a multilateral body even. It really does need to be context specific, which I don't think is necessarily a surprise to anyone on this call, that, we need sector specific, context specific resources for our very specific and high risk problems. And so I would definitely encourage you to check out the report. It's really interesting how it kind of breaks it down and how it scores some of these instruments against the criteria. I think the chat is working for hosts, so I will share the link in the chat, and then I think I'll hand back to you, Fernanda.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So beyond risks, we also wanted to look at sort of like key structural barriers that are limiting AI adoption. First, we see that there's a very large, very important weak evidence base. So there's an absence of reliable, transparent evidence. Interviewees especially described a consistent pattern of inflated success narratives. AI deployments are presented without rigorous measurement. Failures are rarely surfaced or shared. And the cases that do circulate in the sector systematically overstate what has been achieved. This can distort expectations and weaken planning for organizations. Some organizations also struggle to assess return on investment because comparative data is inconsistent, methodologies vary, and success metrics are rarely standardized. And this is especially important in a funding-constrained sector where opportunity costs are high, weak business cases risk misallocating scarce resources and chipping away the leadership buying that sustained AI adoption needs. Second, we see an operationalization deficit. Organizations normally know what responsible AI looks like, or can have that information at hand, but they lack the templates, the readiness checks, the scaling plans to actually do it. Third, and maybe the most obvious, financial barriers. Individual experimentation can be free through, for example, over-the-counter tools, but organizational adoption is not. Enterprise licenses, compliance, costs, monitoring, dedicated personnel add up really, really fast. Next, we see capacity constraints. AI adoption is also frequently constrained not by ambition, but by the absence of dedicated human resource investment. In most organizations, AI-related responsibilities are layered on top of existing roles rather than supported by dedicated capacity. This creates a lot of structural fragility. For example, initiatives depend on a small number of internal champions, and when those people leave, momentum can stall. Next, we also see a failure to scale. The inability to move beyond pilots is maybe the most widely recognized and consistent expressed frustration across our interviews. Projects are normally designed for single context without foresight. For cross-office deployment, institutional coordination mechanisms are often weak to support scaling at all. And finally, we also see use case identification and problem framing gaps. Program experts are usually not trained to translate workflow pain points into AI opportunities. So the default is tool-led rather than problem-led adoption. Still, I just want to highlight here that these challenges have to be understood in context, as their relative weight can vary a lot depending on organization structure and operating environment. For example, research from last year, I believe, on humanitarian supply chains, specifically in Ghana and South Africa, found that human capital gaps and data integration complexity posed bigger obstacles to AI adoption than organizational factors like financial constraint, leadership buy-in or resistance to change. So in that setting, investing in technical skills and infrastructure prove more critical than organizational change management. So if we go to the next slide, we sort of like stepping back and looking at both the literature and sector reports and our interview findings. There are 5 main takeaways that are directly relevant to a potential humanitarian AI Lighthouse or initiative. First is that the sector doesn't show a knowledge deficit, but rather an operationalization deficit. This means a lack of guide, like there are guidance and frameworks. What's missing are the tools to apply it, the readiness assessments, the implementation templates, the scaling methodologies. Next, we see that fragmentation is one of the deepest structural problems right now. Organizations are experimenting in isolation, generating learning that doesn't travel. And we can already sort of see a winner-takes-all dynamic where larger organizations capture AI benefits while smaller and locally led ones fall further behind. Next, we see that AI might be intensifying existing tensions, not necessarily creating new ones. Tensions between efficiency versus equity, headquarters versus field, innovation versus accountability. AI is making these tensions sharper and in some cases faster moving. We also see that content is not necessarily the problem, curation and accessibility are. Existing guidance is largely fragmented, buried in static repositories, and normally formatted for specialists rather than practitioners. Last, we see that the primary value lies in combining content curation with active community facilitation. Practitioners need peer dialogue, honest evidence, practical tools, and a trusted space to surface, for example, shadow AI practices. So taking all this into account, we propose 4 core functions the Lighthouse can be designed around. First is the community infrastructure, so having active orchestration of peer exchange. This can mean segmented working groups, peer matching, moderated spaces where practitioners can surface informal practices without institutional fear. The second component would be a practical implementation support and responsible AI navigation layer that can bridge the operationalization gap. This means curating structure readiness assessments, use case evaluation frameworks, reusable implementation templates. While on the responsible AI side, this can mean curating humanitarian specific risks, checklists, vendor evaluation frameworks, and above all, sort of like a living repository of honest business cases or use cases, documenting not just outcomes, but costs, governance, and what didn't work. The third component would be a market intelligence and technology curation layer, the Lighthouse acting as a sort of vendor neutral intermediary. We see that humanitarian organizations largely lack scale to negotiate or the expertise to compare tools and intelligence to find alternatives, or maybe the time constraints to find these alternatives. The Lighthouse can provide some sort of curated, regularly updated tool comparisons assessed against humanitarian relevant criteria, including small language models for low connectivity and multilingual field environments. And lastly, we propose a strategic coordination component. The sector can, from our view, can highly benefit from funding alignment, partnership facilitation, and aggregating the sector's voice with technology providers and AI governance bodies. And here a particular priority stands out, which is actively recruiting local national organizations, especially in the Global South, currently the least served by existing initiatives, but normally the best place to understand on the ground realities. So yeah, looking forward to hearing about your questions, insights, and comments.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. And yeah, it was really, really great to see, looking at what research found, some of the things we knew, some that we probably didn't. And then the thinking, how could that then become the something structure that might help us move the sector as a whole forward. Now, before we go to that conversation, one of the issues mentioned was obviously around scaling, which isn't necessarily an AI specific issue either in the sector. As I said in the beginning, scaling existing projects was also part of the work we did. So Elizabeth, can you talk a little bit about what that entailed and what we found?
Yeah, definitely. So, so as Daniela said, we launched these two grants with the generous support of Elrha to two of our NetHope members, IRC, International Rescue Committee, and NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council. And we were looking to support organizations who were on one of two scaling journeys that we'd identified. So, we talked about sort of the pilotitis that had been, semi-endemic in the sector for the last couple of years, where there is innovation funding, but there's not necessarily scaling funding or sustainability funding. And so this was one of the areas that we felt we could not only support our members on existing AI projects that they had developed, but also that we could, really capture that learning to then facilitate, beyond these grants, and really take those learnings and practice and be able to implement that across, the wider sector. So these were $50,000 each, rapid turnaround funding, looking for projects that either sat in the realm of scaling where the pilot's been tested. We know it's a solid idea. It works in sort of that space, scaling that to the organization, to the wider organization, whatever that looks like. So it might be to, country offices, it might be to wider staff, et cetera, but within the organization. And then the second, pathway is that an organization has done that. They've piloted, they've tested it within the organization, it's scaled, and now it's for the benefit of the wider sector. So it's kind of the extra step. And now, of course, depending on organizational size, the AI project, et cetera, there's nuance to this. There will be more than two journeys. It takes different shapes, but we did manage to fund two AI projects that fit these two journeys very well, which is really exciting. So I'll talk briefly about both of these. I think some of them might actually be fairly well-known names at this point, but happy to kind of dive into this another time, and hopefully with the members themselves who were much closer to the projects. But I'll start with IRC. So this was an extension of their signpost. So starting on that wider scale side of things, IRC already had Signpost AI. It's been developed. It's been launched in many different arenas and many different projects and countries. They have a dedicated team working on this. And so what they were looking to do essentially was how can they start to increasingly work with partners, get the cost down, get the risks understood, so that they can model that for future scaling. So again, kind of scaling beyond just the organization to the wider sector. And so they were working on this project, an iteration of Signpost AI, where in Colombia, it was essentially a client-facing conversational agent. So this was a Colombia deployment called Infopalante. It was built to serve Venezuelan migrants and refugees who need to navigate documentation, services, their legal rights in a really complex situation and complex and dynamic situation. And the results from the simulation round were really compelling. So I've added like a couple of the key learnings, but there's obviously a lot more to this. But one of the aspects of this that I think is useful for sector-specific versions of AI is how they developed this tool. Notably, it was designed to communicate accessibly, so without technical language. It responded with empathy, and it adapted responses as conversations developed. And importantly, it was not entirely automated. So it was very much a hybrid project that was by design. So, when we see numbers like, it improved response time by 98.75%, which was just like an incredible number. And then we see 46% of conversations were appropriately escalated to humans. That was a really solid number of conversations where it then brought in this hybrid model where it was able to triage and get the conversations that needed to be reviewed by humans. It was able to do that effectively, essentially. And so that was, improving the response time from 28 minutes to 21 seconds. We could just let that settle in for a minute, the amount of scale there. And then having those escalation protocols be validated, so they worked. So having nearly half of the conversations being flagged for human review was really intentional. So the AI, essentially, to sum up, handled the volume, but humans handled the complexity, which is really, I think, what we want to see in the sector and in these contexts. And what the grant was able to produce beyond just, the deployment itself was, exactly as Fernanda was talking about, that is missing or lacking is, reusable toolkits. So playbooks, templates, responsible deployment questionnaire. They, have an understanding of how much it's going to cost, which is a huge barrier for many organizations. And so essentially, packaging up this model to be able to deploy it with other partners in the future is now underpinning their next funding cycle. They're targeting 16 new deployments across 6 continents. So the scale really was very impressive with this. And again, this was a rapid turnaround. This was in 3 months with good funding, but also limited funding. It can only go so far. And so that was really exciting to see how we were able to support this type of project, have this kind of results with the funding that was available, which is great. The second project was on the journey of scaling within a wider organization. So less kind of further down the line, but still tested and true within, beyond just the pilot phase. So this was NRC's CLEAR project. So CLEAR is quite different from the other project as well. So we got lots of really useful learnings from this one as well. CLEAR is crisis learning, early warning, anticipation, and response. It is it's about the back end of humanitarian response. So it's looking at getting fragmented situational data into one place so that decision makers can actually see what's happening in the field. So one of a key issue or problem area that they wanted to resolve with this phase of funding was how their information management, the staff, the officers who work with information management were spending most of their time manually pulling data from different systems and building it into a dashboard, which, again, if you're familiar with this area of work, you might already be familiar with. It's something that I have also had to kind of contend with. And what they were able to do with the AI component of CLEAR is use a RAG approach, so retrieval augmented generation, to essentially synthesize curated data rather than searching the open web, which was a deliberate choice to avoid risk like hallucinations, and really have that be useful in what it is returning. And so this was a part of this funding that we were able to provide was able to scale a part of this wider project, which is a longer term project that they're working on. And so specifically in this space of time, they were able to develop that self-hosted open source RAG pipeline that's API ready, that is now available or will be available to partner organizations to be able to adopt. Because one of their findings, for example, was that the self-hosted option, it was something that they were exploring, can be really costly, like high cost and high resource intensive if it's only at the individual level. But if it's built and owned by the humanitarian sector for the context that we're working on, and this is a model that they're testing, so not just the AI model itself, but the business case essentially, that actually does work out really well over time, as opposed to buying licenses for your entire organization, for example, and it's context specific, which is great. So I think the headline from NRC's project was that essentially the AI worked, which is great, but the data infrastructure around it didn't. So this is similar-ish to IRCs in that they had challenges around the content, like out-of-date content. But for NRC specifically, they did struggle a bit with some of the geographic data and the levels that were intending to feed this, and that made the system less useful for operational planning than it was intended. But again, it's a learning, and it was part of this kind of longer project that they're working on, and they were able to still package this up as package up that pipeline and to be API ready. So that's great. So I think maybe just to summarize quickly, these two projects gave us lots of insights. I tried to select like what would be the most useful in 5 minutes, which is very difficult. But I think I would also just echo some of the things that we learned from the research applies here too. That, and namely for these two, that like the technology barrier is, I think, lower than you would expect. But the organizational and data readiness side of things is higher. Again, for these two projects specifically, but it was very interesting to see it in practice. And again, on a shorter timeline, and with projects that are growing beyond just the pilot phase. So we're very happy to have had that support and share the learning back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and great to see that we have examples where AI can scale, AI use can scale, and there were a lot of questions also submitted to that end, and how does the scaling work? So this is really encouraging to see. But I'm now going to actually stop sharing because we are done with slides, as you'll be pleased to hear. So we've got the research, we've got some really great learnings from the scaling. Now, the obvious question I'm sure everyone wants to hear the answer to is, so what now? What's coming next? Dan, can I start by putting you on the spot on that one?
Thank you, Tanya. Firstly, thank you very much for those really interesting presentations. It's great to see the work in practice always. So yeah, really, now the real work starts. The research told us what the sector needs. So the next phase is really turning that into something more concrete without rushing to build the wrong thing. And as Fernanda mentioned, the clearest signal is that the sector doesn't need another repository, but fill in that operationalization deficit. And what people told us they value, and what the report backs up really, is the connection and exchange. So learning from peers who've actually done the work. And so we're designing it. So yeah, what we're designing is less a library and more of a living thing. So it's a trusted curation of what works, with real coordination and like a peer exchange around it. And it has to meet organizations where they actually are, because what's useful to a large NGO with a dedicated technology team is like often very different from what's useful to a small organization doing this with no specialist support and not much time. So rather than one offer for everyone, it needs to flex to where an organization is on its journey and what realistic has to work with. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we're also really clear that this should build on what already exists, not start over. There's good work out there already, things like Safe AI on the responsible side, and our job is to fill the gaps that no one is covering alone. So that coordination and connective tissue, that's a word, rather than competing with what's out there. And we're treating equity as a design requirement, so not something that we add later, but which means bringing in local and national organizations, especially in the Global South, from the start. Because they're the least served by the current support and the best place to understand what responsible adoption really takes. But I'll be honest with you, a lot of it's still very open. We just spent 2 days with NetHope working through the genuinely hard questions, and what it should focus on. So yeah, we're like looking at things like what it should focus on and what it deliberately shouldn't, and how to build a really like a founding community that isn't the usual well-resourced players. And none of that is really decided yet, and I wouldn't pretend that is, but the aim of this phase is to really get everything ready, so the moment it's properly resourced, it can launch well and launch right.
Thank you, Dan. Elizabeth, anything you want to add? There were lots of post-its involved, I can say that, for our conversations.
Yeah, I think competing for most post-its workshop, I think. No, I mean, it's as Dan said, and I think also just thinking back to the recommendations of the report that Fernanda had showed, those 4 pillars, it is, I mean, I think what was helpful was even after diving really deep into the the problem statement, reflecting on the scoping research, and of course the time in between, because AI is developing very quickly, the sector's response is also developing very quickly, and kind of reflecting back on what we were originally thinking with what an initiative might look like by and for the sector. It was actually really helpful in the 2 days of the workshop to essentially validate a lot of that as well. Like we really didn't stray far from that those original uses of what this initiative would do, or purpose of what it would do. And so I think the only difference was kind of trying to see how we could not only provide the like dynamic resources, so it's not just a static library, but really keeping that to time and to pace, building that community foundation, the infrastructure, to be able to draw like continual lessons learned from the community, of AI champions, AI practitioners, et cetera. But also, what are the other mechanisms that we can pull on that we maybe didn't touch on as much in the research, like funding opportunities, other partnerships, kind of a thing. So I think, so just to say, yes, still under development, but very promising to see that we're definitely able to trace like the research itself, and kind of what led to us doing the research, to the findings themselves, and then actually putting that into practice, I think will be really exciting.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So yeah, do watch that space as we continue to have those conversations. I'm having a look at the Q&A here, and there's quite a number of good questions on there. So there's quite a few questions around the 2 scaling projects. We hope to have a session with them where we'll have the organizations themselves in the virtual or actual room to go through that a little bit in more detail, and also with an opportunity to ask them questions directly, because our responses would be at best secondhand. Also, I think Signpost for sure has a website where they have a lot of information about the product itself, but also about the whole process of implementing and scaling it, which I recommend to go and have a look. There's a question here on operational efficiency versus transformation and social change. Elizabeth, anything that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Lisa, if I'm going to represent your question very well, but the way I was interpreting it was, there's a difference between AI as being, driving that operational change versus AI being used for, like when you say driver for transformation and social change, as in being actually pushing that forward. If that is an accurate representation of what you were asking, I think you're right that this is less focused on the sort of impact itself of like humanitarian operations, the sort of end impact, but I don't know that I would separate them quite into those camps in regards to the research, because operational efficiency, yes, is one side of it, but it was also about just the realities of organizations coming to grips with AI in order to, drive the transformation, drive social change. So I don't know that I'm really giving this justice, but I think I would say that we weren't maybe as I don't know. Well, I don't know, Fernanda. I don't know. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that we drew as much of a through line to AI itself is supporting or inhibiting these things, as opposed to catching up with where it is and just sort of look like the snapshot of where the sector is on the state of AI right now, and how it's impacting operations and delivery.
Yeah. If I can just add something there. So I think this is indirectly covered in the reports. We largely see that organizations are predominantly integrating AI tools into existing workflows or using it to aid existing pain points. And this is not exclusive to the humanitarian sector. We're also doing it here at the university. But so it's not really, AI is not necessarily being integrated strategically. So given this reality, it'll be very difficult to integrate AI as a driver for transformation and social change. Also, transformative impact is rarely defined, / people have differing views of what this means, or sometimes it's impossible to measure or actually define it. So even if we think about, for example, the counterfactual impact, so what would have happened without the tool, causality is very difficult to prove. So what I would add here, maybe the starting point would be donors and implementers need to agree upfront on what they're measuring. The sector also needs sort of shared evaluation frameworks. I feel like right now every organization is reinventing the wheel, which makes cross-project comparison kind of impossible. But on this topic, we actually have another project that we are working on with WWF. So I'll send the link. This is a research question. So actually, yeah, we're also trying to figure this out.
Thank you, Fernanda. There's an interesting question here from Chris on pursuing the proliferation of federated learning, decentralized smaller model AIs with reflecting local languages, local data. We talked a little bit about this, Dan, didn't we? Any thoughts there?
I mean, yes, I think that's like quite a solution that's been proposed through our AI grantee grants. So I think it's quite complicated sometimes to do it in practice, but small language models are usually much more preferred to large language models because of that hallucination and bias risk. So I would, yeah, I strongly agree that I think that should be the standard in the sector. But it's a bit harder when you're obviously working with local languages and local data.
Yeah, I love that question, and I was actually thinking about it. I don't know if I have if I can do justice to the question, but I think the honest challenge is that building and maintaining this model still requires a lot of technical capacity most humanitarian organizations or other organizations don't have, and too many disconnected models that can talk to each other could create its own problems. So maybe the most practical path is probably a combination, using frontier models where scale helps and use smaller community-built models where context matters, and build data governance that lets community contribute without giving up control of their data. I think there's a very good project that sort of represents this. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's a Masakane project. But yeah, the bigger point is that this isn't just a technical choice. It's about who holds power over the tools humanitarian organizations depend on, and the question really deserves a more prominent place in how the sector thinks about AI governance.
Yeah, absolutely agree there, Fernando. One question that has shown up quite a lot also in the question that were recorded at registration, and I see there's one in the Q&A now as well, is regarding governance. So we talked about governance a bit and what a complex picture that is at the moment, but what should an organization that gets into AI now, what should they think about in terms of governance? Elizabeth, can you give some thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely. Just preparing to try and fit this in with the time of So I think first of all, I'll just caveat this, but it really depends. It really depends on where your organization is, what the appetite is, what your overall sort of AI readiness is. I think that I would maybe encourage having a look at the report also, just to plug that again. But I do think, of course, that's the report that is really speaking to this. I think that one of the challenges is that, and I'll just make sure I'm actually answering the question so I don't waffle on practical advice on approaching AI initiatives. Yeah, at operational decision making level. Yeah, so I think as you say, looking at mutual effort or inter-organizational effort, this is something that is a real challenge. Most organizations are navigating AI governance largely alone right now. This obviously came up in our report as well about looking at, where that community infrastructure would really be beneficial, and is obviously NetHope is very geared towards providing community infrastructure. So if you're not a part of NetHope, please do join. But I think that having that sector-wide infrastructure and approach to support organizations doesn't really exist outside of pockets like, what we're able to provide, what other organizations might be able to provide within their own partnerships. I think I have a couple of points, but maybe I'll go to Dan because you've got your hand up. So if you're super keen, please go.
No, I just wanted to say, I want to add to what you're saying. So my interpretation from the report is, I don't think what's missing is more governance. The sector doesn't really lack the frameworks or principles. There's plenty of that, but what's missing is that layer that turns them into practice. An organization can really have a really good responsible AI policy, but still we found a lot of our grantees can't answer the question of, can I use this specific tool with this data in this context? So that I think the key thing is about that. What Fernanda mentions is the operationalization. So things like the readiness checks or really simple decision tools that can take something from principle to a yes or no. And on things like informal AI use, which the shadow AI, we shouldn't try to ban it, but we should make the responsible option the easy one, or otherwise people root around it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe just to clarify too, because I think we sometimes say similar but opposite things on what exists and what doesn't exist. I think that there are definitely tools that exist, but the governance frameworks themselves that's what that missing middle is that we found, was that at the individual organization level, yes, many organizations will have a policy, they'll have a tool. There might be some that also live in a static library somewhere that are maybe inaccessible to the rest of the sector. But there's that missing bit across the sort of sector shared approach is what is a big gap right now. And so that I think is a really tricky challenge where especially if organizations are already kind of going at this alone and not necessarily looking beyond their own borders, that gap won't be filled. It's sort of especially with things like funding cuts and staff time and things, we need to just kind of focus on what is available right now. And so I think the thing that we're encouraging is sort of trying to take that sector-wide approach. But also, there are other recommendations around, having someone internally really own that as an AI champion or as part of their day-to-day role, but really owning that internal governance and pushing that forward as an approach that has worked for others. Engaging with the sector, I think, can also support, if you are the only person working in your organization on that, having the backup of other organizations and the practices and the tools that they use is really helpful. We do see some other tools, and we're starting to collate these as well, like the documentation, for example, I mentioned that IRC shared as a result of their scaling. So we're seeing it develop. I'll stop talking now, though, because I can see Danielle's come off mute.
Indeed, and we are already at the end of an hour. I did know this was going to go quickly because there are so many questions, like I said already, that were submitted before the session, and we haven't gotten through all of those, obviously, and sorry, we also didn't get to all the ones in the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for listening, and for submitting your questions. And a big thank you to the panelists for your fantastic presentations and answering the questions. As we said in the beginning, we will be posting the recording, and that will also have the presentation slides, and we'll add to that also resources that hopefully will help to answer some of the questions that we couldn't answer in this session, including also where you can subscribe to the NetHope newsletter for sure. But do watch this space. As you've heard, this is an ongoing discussion very much so. We're looking at how we can move things forward with that joint structure and all the things that we have seen are needed for responsible AI adoption in the sector. So do watch this space. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn or other places. And hopefully see you all again soon in some other AI conversation or event. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.